Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Kim Bottomley, the president of Wellesley College, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. You know, it's wonderful to see so many of you here, especially given the weather, the wintry weather we have outside. But we weren't going to let a little snow stop us from holding this important dialogue on the politics of climate change. Today's discussion is part of the 2014 Madeleine Korbel Albright Institute for Global Affairs at Wellesley College, named, of course, for the former U.S. Secretary of State, a Wellesley woman who proudly hails from the class of 1959. The Albright Institute... The Albright Institute is in its 5th year at Wellesley, and it encourages interdisciplinary learning and intellectual exchange. It accelerates our efforts to learn from, as well as serve cultures and communities around the world. And it serves as a model for the liberal arts in the 21st century. We are committed to a broad interdisciplinary approach because we know that global understanding is not just for political science and economics majors, but it involves anthropology, philosophy, literature, history, religion, science, and indeed all the disciplines and fields that comprise the liberal arts. The Institute is about more than just increasing students' understanding of the world. It's about educating Wellesley women for leadership in that world. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished guests. Carol Browner is the 2014 Mary Jane Durnford Lewis Distinguished Visiting Professor of the Albright Institute. From 1993 to 2001, she served as the administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. Among her accomplishments as the head of the EPA, Ms. Browner adopted the most stringent air pollution standards in our nation's history. She set, for the first time, a fine particle clean air standard, and she led the reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Food Quality Protection Act. Ms. Browner also has served as an assistant to President Obama and was director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy. Currently, she is a senior counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and is a distinguished senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Ms. Browner serves on the board of the League of Conservation Voters, the Advisory Committee of the Export-Import Bank of the United States, the Board of Directors for Bunge Limited, and the Bloomberg Government Advisory Board. Ms. Browner, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Wellesley and a privilege to have you serve as our distinguished visiting professor this year. So thank you. It is now my honor to introduce Madeleine Korbel Albright. Secretary Albright earned a BA with honors from Wellesley College and master's and doctorate degrees from Columbia University's Department of Public Law and Government, as well as a certificate from its Russian Institute. From 1993 to 1997, she served as a U.S. permanent representative to the United Nations and as a member of the President's Cabinet. In 1997, she was named the 64th Secretary of State, becoming the first female to serve in that position, and becoming at that time the highest-ranking woman in the history of the U.S. government. Secretary Albright is a professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She chairs both the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs and the Pew Global Attitudes Project, and serves as president of the Truman Scholarship Foundation. She serves on the Department of Defense's Defense Policy Board, as well as on the boards of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Aspen Institute, and the Center for American Progress. She is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, including her most recent book, Prague Winter, a personal story of remembrance and war. In 2012, Secretary Albright received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. Secretary Albright, thank you for the example you have set for generations of Wellesley women and for leaders around the globe. I'm grateful. And I'm very personally grateful for all the time you continue to give to your Wellesley College. It is now my pleasure to introduce Peter Thomson, who will moderate today's dialogue. Mr. Thomson has been covering the environment for more than 20 years, and he is currently the environment editor for The World, an award-winning global news program produced by Public Radio International, the BBC, and WGBH here in Boston. Mr. Thomson is a distinguished radio journalist whose career includes posts at WFCR in Amherst and WBUR and Monitor Radio in Boston. From 1991 to 2000, he served as the founding editor of Living on Earth, a groundbreaking environmental radio news program. Mr. Thomson has received many awards for his work. He has also served 15 years on the board of the Society of Environmental Journalists and currently is on the advisory board of the Metcalf Institute for Marine and Environmental Reporting. Mr. Thomson is also the author of the critically acclaimed book, Sacred Sea, A Journey to Lake Baikal. Mr. Thomson, we are delighted to have you with us here today. Thank you. Again, I want to thank our distinguished guests, as well as those of you who are in our audience and those of you who are tuning in via webcam. Welcome. And thank you for being here today. It's not a very easy day to be here. And thank you for supporting the Albright Institute. And now it's my pleasure to turn today's program over to Peter Thomson. Peter.
Thanks so much, President Bonnelly. It's great to be here. Let me first apologize for my somewhat casual attire. I had put aside my only good jacket and my best tie to carry out the door with me, and then I put on my warm clothes to get me here and left the rest of it at home. So it's great to be back at Wellesley. I have a long family history association with this college, but my own personal one began just about 10 years ago when I was setting out to write the book that President Bottomley referred to, and I was looking for folks to help me, and I went online, and I just happened to find a curriculum for a course taught here at Wellesley College by Tom Hodge in Russian Studies and Marianne Moore in Biology, co-taught on Lake Baikal. I thought their syllabus was fantastic, and I just cold called them and asked them if they might be willing to help me with this book, and they had no idea who I was or what I was doing, and I didn't really have any idea what I was doing. But they generously offered to help, and over the next few years, they were more helpful than just about anybody who was involved in working with me on that project. I'm not sure the book would have been published without them, and I am absolutely certain that it wouldn't have been anywhere near as good or as well received as it was without them. So I'm in eternal debt to both Tom and Marianne for that, and they bring me out here every year or two to talk about Baikal, so it's usually a considerably smaller audience than this, maybe 10 or 12 people. But anyway, so it's great to be back, and a great pleasure to be here with these two distinguished government officials, diplomats, folks who have just made an amazing difference in the world. I was earlier asking, what should I call you? Secretary for the Secretary of State, obviously. Wasn't so sure about whether I should call Carol Browner administrator, and they both said, call us Madeleine and Carol. So I will follow that lead. Just to kind of set the context for this a little bit, I thought I'd just whiz through a few headlines just from the last few days, going back maybe to the middle of last week, just to sort of show the breadth and the intensity of what's going on around climate change. And this is just a tiny sampling. Starting just yesterday, 2013 declared again one of the warmest 10 years on record. All of the warmest 10 years on record have occurred since 1998, and I believe 9 of them since the year 2002. No relief for Earth's warming trend in 2003, studies find. That's from Reuters. 2013 tied for 4th warmest year on record from The Guardian. Some other related news: California drought and the polar vortex, the new normal by 2030. Seafloor marine life faces major threat from climate change. Extreme weather wreaking havoc on food as farmers suffer. Last week, we had a leaked version of the latest chapter from the new IPCC report. That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is releasing the 3rd part of its latest scientific review in April. A report is out, says, New York Times says, UN says lag in confronting climate change will be costly. UN climate report urges quicker switch to low-carbon global economy. That's from The Guardian in the UK. This week in Davos at the World Economic Forum, climate change leads agenda at Davos Economic Talks. That's from Environmental News Network. President Obama, clean energy experts offered to Obama a plan forward without Congress. Environmental groups say Congress needs to address climate change more aggressively. The EU has just announced carbon emissions cuts by 40% by 2030. That's also from The Guardian. Richest countries failing to combat climate change. China must spend $330 billion more to do their fair share on climate. Climate scientists to U.S. Senate. Climate change is a clear and present danger. And meanwhile, global warming denial hits 6-year high, from Mother Jones. A lot going on the technology front. Just a couple of headlines that stuck out for me the last few days. Elon Musk, he's the Tesla guy, one of the greatest inventors in the US today. Elon Musk's 5 insights into solar energy. Sugar Battery offers hope of green-powered gadgets within 3 years. That's also from The Guardian. Pakistan's parliament to go solar amid power crisis. Indian microgrids aim to bring millions out of darkness by microgrids, a lot of which are powered by solar and wind energy. So those are just, some of the massive swirl of events and things that are going on around climate change. And yet, when you talk with folks around the world who really know this issue well, even the ones of those which represent some movement and some progress, folks say, are nowhere near enough. And that's my first question to both of you. How close do you think we are to really meeting the challenge that scientists say we face in tackling this increasingly urgent problem?
Well, it's wonderful to be here with you and with my friend Carol. Everything I know about the subject is learned from Carol. We're obviously very good friends, but we made friends when we were both on President Clinton's cabinet, and we were kind of to the end of the line because I was the UN ambassador and she was doing EPA. So we bonded over that, and there were not a lot of women. There were 4 or 5 of us in the cabinet, and we have been friends ever since. There is nobody that understands this issue better. And to match your oceans, Carol has just been put on the Ocean Commission, and a number of, and I'm wearing a fish in your honor. So,
I've heard you never leave home without your bird.
That's true. So, but I just want to say to everybody here how terrific it is that Carol has come up to do the Institute. And Carol, I want to I've thanked you privately, but I'm now going to thank you in front of Wellesley. So thank you very, very much. I believe that people are beginning finally to understand this, but are we close to resolving it? I think we have a lot of politics that get in the way. And you missed one important news story or column. This morning, Tom Friedman, whom in face-to-face, I always call him President Friedman because he seems to have better ideas than most people. But he basically said that in talking about what's going on in Syria, that is due to droughts, and in terms of various migrations that have taken part of it. So it is an issue which is part of our national security, not only because we're going to be hot and fry to death and various things, but also because it has huge implications for the politics of various countries. And yet, I do think that it is one of the more complex issues, and also people's delusional aspects of not believing that it really exists. This may surprise people, but I listen to right-wing radio, and I occasionally turn on Fox. And yesterday, they were talking about there is no such thing. This doesn't exist. What is going on in California with the fires, they are, flat earth people. And so I think there really is that problem which makes it hard to get there.
So I think, first of all, I want to thank Madeleine for the opportunity to come here. I see some of the students that I've had the opportunity to spend the last 2 days with, and I'll be with again tomorrow. It's been great. It's been amazing, the presentations you all have made, the poise, the intelligence you bring to the presentations. It's been a really wonderful opportunity. I mean, one of the things, Madeleine and I spend a lot of time in Washington. We spend a lot of time in other capitals around the world. I don't get as much time with young people as Madeleine does, and it's just very refreshing to be able to spend this time and to meet all of you and hear your presentation. So thank you for the invitation to be here, and to all of you who join us in this discussion, thank you. You know, Peter, you started with a long list of interesting headlines, and most of them, as someone who follows this, I had heard in one way or the other. But if there was one that really alarmed me, it was the idea that global warming deniers, or as I call them, the naysayers, are at a 6-year high. And I presume what you mean is there are more of them today than there have been in the last 6 years. And that's true. It does fluctuate with the weather. The worse our weather, the more likely they are to believe there's a problem. The better our weather, the less likely. But, you know, the problem is, and I think your real question was, you know, are we doing enough? And the answer is no. It's obvious that we're not doing enough. These are complicated decisions, and in our form of government, we need the people as part of that decision-making process. And when you have large groups of people who don't believe that there's even a problem to address, it becomes very difficult to have the kind of sensible, informed, fact-informed discussion about what can we do, what should we do, how should we do it. You know, there are lots of decisions embedded in all of this, and unfortunately, we're not having that kind of conversation. We have a situation in Congress where I think like at least, certainly once a month, if not once a week, the House of Representatives does something to either vote EPA out of existence, vote their money out of existence, say that climate change isn't real, say that EPA shouldn't regulate climate change. I mean, that's the level of the discourse in Washington. It's not to say that President Obama and the EPA aren't doing a whole series of important things, and I'm sure we'll get to that. But in the meantime, you have this elected body who is simply denying that there is, not all of them, but unfortunately a majority of them, denying that there's even a problem, not listening. Peter referenced the scientists, the IPCC. That's 2,500 of the world's best climate scientists who have all said it's real and we better hurry up and get going. And we just routinely discard it in our Congress these days.
We have two stages in which climate policy is playing out, being fought over. To simplify it, global stage and the national stage. I think probably the US debate has an outsized role in the global debate for a lot of reasons. One is that we're historically the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, although not currently the largest annual emitter, but still the largest historic emitter. Also because we are the world's largest economy, and our politics are totally locked up over it. But I want to ask first about the international situation and what some of the key dynamics are of the conversations, negotiations, et cetera, that are going on internationally. The main thing, of course, is the UN process through the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which produced the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and that was a fairly hopeful moment, and that by most accounts, has really failed to accomplish what it was hoped to accomplish for a lot of reasons. And as someone who's attended some of the meetings at which the arguments are battled out over the years, the process is really ground almost to a standstill. And I'm wondering whether, as a former ambassador to the UN, what hope you have for that process, the United Nations process, as a multilateral process that involves every country in the world having a vote, having a say, or whether you feel that that is played out, ill-advised today, not meeting the needs, whether there's really any hope in that or whether we need to be looking elsewhere.
Well, I do think that as one looks at it as a global problem, in order to solve it, countries have to participate in it. And one of the things one of the books I wrote was a memo to the president-elect at the time that I didn't know who it was going to be. I ultimately did give it to President Obama, and I inscribed it with the audacity to hope that this book might be useful. And I had 5 big umbrella issues that had to be dealt with. And one of them was the whole issue of environment and energy. And the point of listing them, and the others were how to deal with terrorism without creating more terrorists, how to deal with nuclear proliferation, then how to deal with a growing gap between the rich and the poor in the world, and then also how to restore the good name of democracy. And the financial thing had not been going on at the time. But just listing those makes very clear that no matter how strong and rich and everything the United States is, you can't do it alone. And so you have to operate within some kind of a global setting. There's lack of faith in the UN generally. I mean, I think there is a sense among many Americans that the UN has helicopters that swoop down in the middle of the night and steal your lawn furniture. And then some people don't like the UN because it's full of foreigners, which can't be helped. And so, but the bottom line is that, in fact, this does require a multilateral solution. The problem is that the process is very slow. And it does, in fact, and this came up in Kyoto, which is something we actually did work together on, is that the world is divided in a major way between developed and developing, north-south rift. And there clearly, it was evident then, is that the developing countries said, you all have used all this technology to develop yourself. Now you are not letting us do it, and it's a sign that you don't respect us, that you don't understand what our problems are. And I remember President Clinton giving a speech on this in China, basically saying, you know, you don't have to go through all the steps that we made. You can leapfrog, but it was viewed as a north-south issue, rich-poor, and that's been part of the major difference. I think that one of the issues that has to be out there, and I speak on this from experience, is that the U.S. has to be a part of these negotiations. This is a somewhat different problem, but something else that I lived through was the landmine treaty. And we decided for a long time that we wouldn't participate in the landmine treaty. And then all of a sudden it got ahead of us in terms of the Canadians pushing it in a way where there were definitions that we couldn't agree with. And then it made it very hard for us to ratify it. And so despite the irritation of the slowness of the process, the United States does have to be the leader there. But ultimately, it is the national policies, and Carol can talk about those, that then, in fact, make the global arena work. But I don't think it does any good just to have national policies. They have to be within that global setting. But it is very slow. People don't like the word multilateralism. It has too many syllables and ends in an ism. But it basically is just a matter of partnerships and trying to deal with problems that can't be solved by one country alone.
I think we should remember that President Obama did go to Copenhagen, which was the sort of last world leaders meeting on this. And, you know, I joined him in that trip, and it was a very difficult trip, including, you know, the Chinese telling us, our staff, that they had left when they were actually still there, and so we had to burst into the room and have a meeting kind of on the fly with the Chinese, the Indians, and the Brazilians, which was not an easy thing to do. And I think that it's probably fair to say that there was sort of incremental, modest, but that's probably all you could hope for out of Copenhagen. The problem, to Madeleine's point, is what happens after the meetings. At Kyoto, high hopes, but what happens afterwards? And I think this is, where the national policies really become important. And here's where I think the president has, done a series of national things. He's committed to do a series of things around power plants to require the reduction of greenhouse gases. Clearly, the U.S. is going to have to lead. We're going to have to lead both in achieving reductions or mitigation of greenhouse gases. We're also going to have to lead in terms of technologies and helping to share our technologies. I mean, we're at a point now in the United States where we can make electricity from solar and sell it sort of at a price competitive price with coal and other types of energy. And that's in part because of what the Chinese have done and others have done. But I think that we're going to have to really step up and not just do what's right domestically, but also help the rest of the world.
Back to the international stage for a moment. The UN process is going to continue, regardless of whether a lot of progress is made or a small amount of progress is made. But there, as you said, there are also other relationships that are extremely important and other fora between two countries, between groups of countries. Where do you see the most, what among those other fora, those other relationships, do you see as the most important, and where do you see as the most productive right now?
Well, in a general way, let me say, we are going through a particularly difficult period in terms of relations between and among countries, I would say. And the trends that are out there that are dominating in many different ways is that we are all much more interdependent, but that is also creating kind of a counterintuitive thing, which means that you then get much more nationalistic, as it's a peculiar kind of contradiction that's going on at this moment. And then also developments of technology that we don't quite know how they work and what they should do. What has happened is that as a result of the mega trends, which I'm happy to talk about at some other point, but basically what has happened is lack of faith in institutions. And it's lack of faith in the national institutions and in the international institutions. So I would say that the UN is not at a great place at the moment, even though it is theoretically hosting a meeting on Syria as we speak. But there really are issues as to how it works. Therefore, what has happened is there's been a creation of other entities that are a little bit ad hoc. And so there are some discussions of some of this within the G20, which is kind of a larger group. And then part of it, the G8, which initially was just an economic grouping, but it becomes political. What is interesting now in the way that it's coming about is there are environmental discussions to do with our trade agreements. And so there are two huge trade agreements going on or trying to be negotiated. One that is in Asia, the TTP, and then there's one in Europe, the TTIP. And so environmental issues are very much a part of it. The course that I teach at Georgetown is, I say foreign policy is just trying to get some country to do what you want. That's all it is. So what are the tools? And so my course is the National Security Toolbox. And trade agreements, in many ways, are very good vehicles for getting certain policies that you want. So if a country wants to have relations with you, then we put a certain number of environmental conditions on them. The question is whether the other countries they have to want to have an agreement with us to have the environmental conditions. And that is exactly, I'm surprised, if you look at some other headlines, they also do talk about the problems now, specifically on the TTP, because some of the partners in the Pacific and the Asian region do not wish to go along with some of our environmental. So those kinds of negotiations, and then they do come up in bilateral. I mean, when you go in, when the President of the United States or the Secretary of State or the Ambassador to China goes in to have a discussion, the environment is clearly one of the issues. There are a lot of issues. So it takes place in a number of these venues, and you try to play all the venues, and you're venue shopping, basically, and you try to figure out where you get the greatest purchase.
Yeah, and I think there's a number of bilateral discussions right now with the Chinese, with the Indians, they have complete environmental sort of discussions going on. Every year the environment minister from China comes to the United States. I got to know him when I was at EPA. We meet, so it's working both government to government, but also from the NGO to the government in China. But I chair the Track 2 dialogue between NGOs, businesses in the United States with NGOs and businesses in the India. So you have a lot of these bilateral. I think, the kind of global solution that perhaps people like us would like to think about is very hard to achieve. So you have to kind of break this apart and take it kind of piece by piece. So for example, in the G8, they have had a lot of discussions led by the president on fossil fuel subsidies and trying to end. Now, here in the United States, we have to go to Congress to actually end those fossil fuel subsidies. We've provided fossil fuel subsidies dating back to I think the first one was in 1914. They're still on the books today. Congress doesn't seem inclined to do it. But at least, as to Madeleine's point, these issues are getting put into the broader discussion of security, of international relationships in a way they weren't, even as recently as 15, 20 years ago. And I think that's hugely important.
One of the things, Carol mentioned non-governmental organizations. I have a whole new kind of pet project that I talk about, are public-private partnerships, because our businesses can play a huge role in environmental policy. And so if X company that actually has to, take Coca-Cola for instance, they have to use local water. So they have to figure out what they have an environmental policy. And so part of it is trying to figure out how the government and private businesses and NGOs work together, which provides another set of relationships and venues.
I want to come back to a couple of items that you both touched on here. One is China. I know you have a special interest in China. As Secretary of State, you couldn't avoid having a special interest in China. China, of course, is now the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, although, as was driven home this last week, a good deal of that, perhaps as much as 25%, is to make stuff that gets sent right back here. So we're basically exporting a lot of our emissions to China. But nonetheless, they are a huge source of greenhouse gas emissions. They have been, in some ways, our largest, perhaps, adversary, or at least the most difficult negotiating partner in in the UN process. And yet, they are also making tremendous strides. I think that they understand that this is an extremely serious problem for them. And there has been talk about the US and China working together in some very specific ways. What do you see? Do you see any hope in that relationship, in us working together off the radar of the UN, off of whether they're official agreements or otherwise, to make real progress just between our two countries?
Well, I think what we have to understand is every country negotiates with whomever from their national interest. Mostly there are not a lot of altruistic aspects of this. What has happened is the Chinese know they can't breathe. For anybody that has been in Beijing, you can't see out your windows, and people are getting sick, and a variety of issues are coming up. What is also interesting is that there is pressure from the Chinese people in terms of being fed up with pollution, polluted rivers, mines that aren't safe. And what is interesting, I have been involved in many interesting and crazy discussions, but one of them now out of office was to have Democrats and Republican political leaders go and meet with the International Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And the question is why they wanted to meet with us. And we've done several meetings, and I think partially it is to get recognition, but partially because they have pressure at the bottom of their pyramid from people that are concerned about urban-rural problems, about pollution, about a variety of things. So they are getting pressure on that. So I do think that there are areas where there can be some exchange of ideas and information and a variety of aspects to work on this problem, because they want to figure out how to solve it. Their problem is that they are energy hungry, they are trying to figure out, and so their national security policy also has a lot to do with this. And we can have a larger discussion about some of the things that they're doing in Africa, where I was in Kenya, for instance, and there was some idea that they wanted a road that kind of partially cut through the Serengeti, and we, American company, would say, well, we can't do that because of environmental restrictions, and the Chinese would say, where do you want it? And so there is that kind of a thing where they're beginning to look at some of their internal issues, but they also have other policy needs from their perspective and national interest. But I think that well, you had head-to-head discussion, but they need advice, and if they don't see it as American dominance, they don't see it, and it goes back to what I said when President Clinton was there, which was basically, why are you robbing us of the possibility of becoming an industrialized nation using the same kind of techniques you did? Whereas if Carol goes and she can explain, you can do better through other techniques.
I mean, I think the two things to know about China, one is, as Madeleine said, they're energy hungry. We're talking about 400 coal-fired power plants that they are projecting to build. We heard yesterday, there's a new study out, that the air pollution that's generated in China takes about 10 days, not all of it, but a chunk of it, to hit California. So here we are doing all this work in the US to drive down conventional air pollution, and yet we're going to experience this transport of air pollution all the way from China. So not only is it in their interest, it's in our interest. I think, and you made this point, they have an emerging environmental movement. And if you think about the history of the pollution movement in this country, first we have a lands movement, and Teddy Roosevelt, does all the work, and we create a national park system. But then, starting in the late 60s, early 70s, you actually have this whole anti-pollution movement, and you have the first Earth Day, which when you add up all the people who demonstrated in local communities, it's the biggest demonstration in the history of the US. You have EPA created by Richard Nixon. But what's important to note is at the same time, you have the emergence of a middle class. So people's quality of life is becoming secure, and they're looking around and they're saying, we don't want to breathe dirty air. We don't want our kids to breathe dirty air. We don't want dirty water. And I think you see the very same thing happening in China with this emergence of the middle class, perhaps partially the one-child policy. These parents are saying, you know what, we don't want this anymore. And you're starting for the first time to really see pressure on the political leadership. Now, what they do about it, if they can learn from sort of our history and maybe leapfrog, I mean, I think that's still an open question, but I think it is really, really very good news that there does appear to be this sort of emerging grassroots movement for clean air, for clean water. As we both know, the challenge of climate change is the pollutants we're talking about. You can't really see them, you can't really taste them, but frequently in reducing the pollution you can see, taste, you'll do some good on the climate side as well.
Even at the level of cook stoves that millions of people around the world use to cook their food that release stuff that is killing them
right.
in terms of lung disease, and also is incredibly powerful as a contributor to greenhouse warming. So I want to ask you both about a couple things that you've each been focusing on in your private lives out of government. Madeleine, infrastructure, I understand, is something you've been putting a lot of emphasis on in dealing with what will be built and not built, how will they be built, what will be done to create the cities, communities that the next 3 billion people are going to live in, as well as the 7 billion who are already here. And to what degree the need to avoid worsening the problem of climate change, if not helping to make it better, is being taken into account in those kinds of decisions. And also the impact of climate change. I mean, as we saw with Sandy and Haiyan and so many extreme weather events recently, the lack of infrastructure to deal with rising sea levels, among other things, is astounding. And what came out of those was that we have to change how we build things. We have to change the way that we engage with the natural world as the climate changes. So on that, I wonder, how do you see that emerging in the global infrastructure community? And Carol, for you on renewable energy efficiency, all the technology that we're going to need to really get a handle on the energy issue, where you see the real progress being made, what are the exciting frontiers there, and how important contribution do you really feel that can make to solving this problem? So this would be a separate question for each of you. Sure, no, understood.
I think, and I'm glad Carol said that, because I have defined infrastructure as larger and larger in terms of, it isn't just who have bridges or over, under tunnels and various things, but generally what is meant as cities enlarge. And I think the most important part, we had a big conference in Istanbul last November, and we're about to do another one in Rio, because what I think people need to do, and it fits exactly with what President Bottomley said, interdisciplinary, is that it really takes a lot more than the concrete pourers or engineers, but it basically takes people that understand where where a city is already, what the demographics of the country are, who are in these communities, what is the culture, and basically what is the historical development of this. Istanbul was a perfect place to have this. And kind of looking at a variety of the historical accretion of aqueducts and various things. So I think that what we are doing is trying to find the intersection of all these different interests so that the civil engineers really understand what they are doing. What happens when you mentioned Hurricane Sandy or whatever, when there is some kind of a disaster? What are the transportation systems? What is it that the people that are moving into the cities actually want? What does technology have to offer? And what we found very interesting is, and I think you find this in any line of work, is people are siloed, and what needs to happen is to have that cross-pollination of discussions. And so I think people are beginning to learn that actually the bridge builders do have something in common with anthropologists who can tell them why this particular community got settled in this place and do they want to stay there. And so various aspects of it. I find it fascinating, and I have a tendency to enlarge subjects as I get more and more interested in them. But Kim, really the interdisciplinary part of this is a big deal, and I think that that's why I'm so pleased with the Albright Institute, because I do think that we can't be siloed in our education and we can't be siloed in our discussions, and we need to kind of learn from each other.
So you may have heard a chuckle when Madeleine referred to Istanbul. There's a group of the Albright Institute students who yesterday made a presentation on the transportation infrastructure issues facing Istanbul. And I mean, it's a bit of a microcosm for when Madeleine and I were together in Istanbul.
I was just in Istanbul and practically fell into the Bosporus, literally, because
I know what's in there.
The boat that I was getting on was docked in a place that was kind of 6 feet down, and I had on high heels, and I made it onto the boat, and then I called the office and I said, you have to get me a hair appointment because I just fell into the Bosporus, and they really thought it was true. But the bottom line is the transportation infrastructure in Istanbul is complicated.
It's very, yes, I was there to rescue her when she fell into the Bosphorus. But I think that the infrastructure issue, that you ask about, designing our cities, we're about to have God knows how many mega cities in ways that really are sustainable. And you asked me about renewables, and I'll get there in a second, because before I just want to mention something about resiliency and adaptation. Look, climate change is a reality, and so when we think about infrastructure, we're now going to have to think about building infrastructure that is resilient, that can recover rapidly from the storms that are going to come more frequently, that are going to be more intensive. And then we also have to think about how can we sort of adapt? How can we use nature perhaps to help prevent some of the worst consequences of storms? And I think, you mentioned, Madeleine mentioned Hurricane Sandy. Well, part of what happened in Hurricane Sandy is the power line to to the lower part of Manhattan, Con Edison very thoughtfully put, I don't know, at 14 feet because the water had never gone to 14 feet. Well, guess what? It came to 14 feet and you lost power to the lower part of the city. And so now the question becomes, well, do you simply put it back higher and hope and pray that the water doesn't get to 16 or 17 feet? I don't know what the answer is. Or do you actually think about encasing it in some sort of watertight material? That's more expensive, but that may be what we need to do to keep our cities functioning. Similarly, the idea, the proposal that Bloomberg and Cuomo put forward for Breezy Point, which is a neighborhood where the police and firemen have had summer homes for generations now. That's actually a floodplain, and if it weren't developed, it could be used to nature could help to absorb some of the storm surge. That's complicated. It involves moving people out of areas that they've lived in for a long time, and even if you pay them top dollar, it's probably not enough to get them another beachfront home in a safer community. So part of infrastructure is going to be, we're going to have to think about this resiliency and adaptation, and that's part of the reality that we increasingly face of climate change. If you had asked me to talk about resiliency and adaptation 5 years ago, I would have said, no, I just want to talk about preventing the problem, but sadly, we now have to engage in this. I think on the renewables front, I think the US is a great case study. What we are seeing is that where you have the right government policies, we're getting the investments in renewables. So for example, there are something like 25 states that have some sort of renewable portfolio standard, clean energy standard, they call them different things, but it requires that a certain percentage of the electricity produced in that state come from renewables. Those states, you're seeing the investments, you're seeing a growth in renewables. The states that don't have a similar government requirement, it's not really happening. You see that where the tax code creates opportunities, rewards investments, the investments being made. So I think that until we have absolute price parity, in other words, that the cost of making, or the sale price of electricity made from renewables is akin to the sale price of electricity made from other sources of energy, it's going to be different without some sort of government incentive. But we use the tax code to incentivize and disincentivize all kinds of behavior. As I said, the oil companies have enjoyed tax breaks dating back to 1918 or something like that. The nuclear industry has enjoyed, I think, some tax issues dating back to 1948 or 1952. So it's not as if we don't have these sort of practices in place, but certainly, thinking about how we use our policies to incentivize these. The one thing that we haven't talked about is natural gas and shale gas. And if we had been having this conversation 5 years ago, we might have bemoaned the fact that we don't really have enough of this and we're going to be importing it. And this is just, I think, a demonstration of how rapidly the energy world can change. It is highly likely, virtually certain, the US will be an exporter of liquefied natural gas. Now, we have so much of it, and in fact, we have had some months in the last 12 to 18 months where we are making as much of our electricity from gas as we make from coal. It's all driven by prices, what can you get cheaper, but that is just a huge, huge change with lots of public policy ramifications. And it's not just a change here, it's a change all around the world. I was in the Middle East for the last 2 weeks. I was in Jordan, I was in the Arab Emirates, and then I was in Israel. And all they wanted to know is, were they going to get access to our gas? It is a fast-changing world out there.
We want to leave plenty of time for questions, so I want to try to rush through 3 last questions, all of which we could spend all day talking about, but just trying to focus real tightly. The backdrop of so much what we've been talking about is the gridlock in the US, fostered by all kinds of things, but certainly the influence of the naysayers, as you put it, who have an extremely large microphone and a lot of money behind them. This country is locked up on climate policy nationally. Do you see any hope of unlocking it? And if so, where is that hope?
Well, Congress isn't the only game in town, right? The president, through existing laws, doesn't have to go to Congress, with existing laws on the book, the Clean Air Act, can regulate emissions from greenhouse gases, and he's doing it. He's already set standards on cars and trucks. He is proposed standards on new power plants, and he's about to propose standards on existing power plants. He's also used authorities to require the manufacture of more efficient appliances if you buy a refrigerator or a dryer, any of those sorts of things, commercial or residential. So using your existing authorities, it may not be the neatest, tidiest way to do it. I mean, I personally think putting some kind of cap, some kind of fee, is probably the simplest way to do it. I think most economists would agree. But nevertheless, I think the president deserves a huge amount of credit. He went to Congress, he said, let's figure this out. They essentially said no. We tried really hard, we got it out of the House, we couldn't get anywhere in the Senate. And he said, okay, fine, I tried. It's a serious problem. Now let me use the authorities I already have on the books. And if he is successful, he will achieve significant, the result of his programs as they come online. Not everyone buys a new car the first year, the less polluting cars are available, but as those programs come online and as those new vehicles and appliances, et cetera, come online, it will be a measurable reduction in greenhouse gases for the United States. And the good news is a lot of those things end up going around the world, right? The degree to which car companies, BMW now makes, I'm going to get this wrong, I think. They are a net exporter of BMWs made in the United States. Okay? They make so many cars in South Carolina, they export to the rest of the world they contribute to the US trade balance. But when they think about the cars they're making, they have to meet American standards, and the degree to which they just incorporate that technology and therefore these cleaner cars go out across the world is good news for all of us. So not only do our standards have impact domestically, they can have global impacts.
Madeleine?
Well, I do think that we have a rather peculiar form of government at this moment, but the executive-legislative relationship is the nexus of how we operate. But I do think that, as Carol has described, what the president's able to do through executive power is important. The other part, I think, is we have to do more to educate our population to understand that we, as citizens, have a role in this, and that but ignorance is a terrible thing. I do think when I listen to the naysayers, I just find it beyond belief. But I think that, if I may compliment you, I really do think that having journalists that are willing to explain this and take the time and go through it makes a huge difference, because I think that it's so easy to get the wrong facts and to try to kind of bulldoze people into thinking that this is not what God intended. So I just think that we have to get a better educated population who then theoretically elect people that understand that something has to be done.
Okay, second to last question, and there are no quick answers to these either, but we've talked about energy and the rise in investment and advances in technology of clean energy and other related things. And Carol, you just raised the issue of putting some kind of price on carbon. There are two sort of general streams of thought on how we as a country should deal with this, and I'll just sort of grossly reduce it to the Stephen Chu School and the Bill McKibben School, with Stephen Chu as the former Secretary of Energy under Barack Obama, who essentially said many times a variation on this, and this is probably a terrible, paraphrase, but if you build it, they will come. That we really need to concentrate on technology, on real breakthroughs in energy generation, clean energy generation, efficiency, efficient machines, all kinds of stuff that we got to invest in that. And when we make those breakthroughs, that people will come to that, the market will come to that, and that will really help solve the problem. Bill McKibben, most of you probably know who he is, activist, journalist, agitator. He basically says, until we put a price on carbon, until we make the polluters pay, until we make the fossil fuel industry pay for the full social and environmental costs of their pollution, and those of us who use those products also pay for that, that nothing will change, and that once that happens, everything will change. Do either one of you ascribe to either one of those?
They're both right. I mean, seriously, we're going to need new technology to get ourselves out of the situation we're in, whether it's resiliency, adaptation, clean energy. I mean, you know, we all like our creature comforts. We like our lifestyles. We are going to need new technologies to sort this out. I think that certainly putting some sort of cap is a way to force the investment in technologies. You know, they're both right. That there's, you know, they're both tools that will help us achieve the ultimate outcome that we want. I think Washington and politics is all about the art of the possible. And I could sit here and I could allow, you know, perfect to be the enemy of the good. And right now, what is possible in Washington is precisely what the president is doing, which is he's looking into the authorities he has. He's tried Congress, they said no, and he's saying, I'm going to do everything I possibly can here. You know, that's the art of the possible. It may not be perfect, but at least we get moving. And you know, one thing I've learned about environmental protection, I've done this a long, long time, and I've been a regulator a long time. Once you establish those regulations, there are people who are going to make money off of them because they build the widget that solves the problem. And suddenly you have a whole voice of support from the business community for those regulations. So no longer are the naysayers the only people out there, but now they're, you know, when I put the tailpipe emission standards in place, the catalytic converter manufacturers were my best friends, right? Because they were gonna sell a lot more catalytic converters. It was good news for them. And so we just gotta get over this hump and get started, and it will drop, I think, a lot of the temperature, and a lot of companies will figure out, hey, you know what? This is good news for me, for my investors.
Madeleine, how do you see that tension playing out internationally?
Well, I think internationally you have the same story. I mean, as to who does the manufacturing, which country gains from it, who is the buyer, who is the seller. And I think we have to understand that in terms of the groupings that will go for it. I was thinking about in terms of, you know, we started out talking about the United Nations, and there are 193 countries, but they bottom line, they organize themselves in very different ways according to what their needs are. So some of them are kind of weird, like there's the non-aligned, and you think, what are they non-aligned between? But, and then there's the non-aligned. But among the groupings were, for instance, small island nations. That then find something in common. And the reason I raise that is that I think Carol's obviously right in terms of this, it's not always X versus Y, but looking at different groupings that might find something in common on a particular issue where they wouldn't find it on everything. And I think it has to be bifurcated according to what's, I believe in the doability doctrine. I mean, I think that if you can get something done, even though it's not the whole story, that it's worth doing.
Okay, last real quick question, then we're going to go to the audience. Knowing what you know now about the science of climate change, the rapidity with which it's advancing, and the state of politics in the United States, and where we've come over the last 10 or 15 years, if you could go back 15 years to when you were in the Clinton administration, what would you have done differently on this issue?
Carol actually had something to do with it, so I'll let her think.
Well, you were Secretary of State.
No, I mean, no, I'll tell you what I think. What I find interesting that I had, this was all new to me when I arrived, and so what I found interesting was actually how the scientists held back on things in terms of there would be a terrible storm or something or flood, and I'd say, why can't we say that this is as a result? Actually, I think global warming is the wrong word because we're freezing, and so people don't understand that, even though what you said is that the Earth has gotten hotter. But I think climate change, sometimes choosing the right vocabulary. But I found very frustrating that people wouldn't allow me to say that the flooding, wherever it was as a result of something. And I think that we could have looked better at some of the other aspects of the North-South divide and understood what the other countries were trying to. It was very new. I mean, and Carol really was the most amazing EPA director, and Al Gore was there. She had worked for vice president and also had done all this in Florida. So I do think that it made the EPA come alive. I could also say that these are not, I worked for Ed Muskie, who did the Clean Water Act and Lake Baikal, by the way. He got really into Lake Baikal. But the bottom line, this is not a new subject, but there has been more interest in it, and yet this is a weird thing to say about the scientists because they're being very careful, and I wish that they had been, you know, a little bit more robust and said, you know, this is why Katrina happened. Yeah.
You know, of course, right? If I knew what I knew today, would I have done more? This is the biggest problem the world has ever faced. And generation after generation has left to subsequent generations complicated problems. We may well be the first to leave a problem that cannot be solved. We are changing the planet. And so I would have done every single thing I possibly could. What we need to do now is get moving. I mean, we cannot continue to delay. It is simply unfair to future generations. Pollution problems that we have solved heretofore, we solved them when you could see it, you could feel it, you could touch it, you could taste it. What we have to do this time around is before we can feel it, touch it, you know, see it, we have to prevent it. That is super hard to do, I am the first to admit. But, you know, I will say this, I am not pessimistic that we can solve this. I think we will sort it out. I think we will get right to the bitter edge. But we're not going to be that generation that leaves these young women a problem that they simply can't solve because the ocean has risen and there isn't an engineer out there who can send it back.
I sure hope not. I've got a young woman who's considerably younger than a few in this room. She's 4 years old, and I would like not to have to leave her with this myself. Okay, we could go on and on and on and on, but we're going to stop talking. I'm going to stop talking. We're going to go to the audience. We've got 2 microphones on both sides. We're just going to take alternating questions. Please try to keep them brief. Please state your name and a brief ID just so we can know who is asking. And I have to say this as someone who's been a journalist and has presided over many Q&As at many conferences. No statements, please. Just questions, and keep them brief. Why don't we start stage right?
My question is about the politics of energy and natural gas, especially when you raise the question of the global world looking to us for natural gas. And what are your insights into how we're dealing with the problems with fracking, which is what makes natural gas so available, from a methane releases, all the water issues, all the things that are going on. Fracking is happening so quickly, and what are we doing about it, and how forward-thinking are we, instead of just saying, great, we have all of the above natural gas.
Well,
Who are you, please?
I'm sorry, Ricky Papo. I live in Lexington, and very interested in climate change.
so the way we get the shale gas out is we frack. We go in there, we break up the rocks, and they're able to release the gas. That's not a scientific explanation. That's an easy to understand. But taking things out of the ground, whether you're BP trying to take oil out of the Gulf of Mexico, whatever, is complicated. It needs to be regulated. There are places where it should not be done. The challenge of the fracking situation is that EPA would be the natural place to establish regulations. There's a reason EPA was created, in part because states couldn't quite sort through how to set standards and enforce those standards. They had competing needs. EPA had authority to regulate fracking until Mr. Cheney went to Congress, Vice President Cheney, and had EPA stripped of that authority. So the methane emissions are probably regulated by EPA, but the actual fracking activity itself, the casing and how they structure the whole thing, is now being regulated on a state-by-state basis. I have no doubt that some states will do a good job, but the concern is that perhaps not all will do it. And I think all of us who look at this see the benefits of the resource if properly extracted and carefully extracted. It is less greenhouse gases when we burn it. It's not the solution, but it's certainly an important step in the process. But the concern, as you raise, is it being properly regulated? And I think that's something we're only sadly going to know with time. I do not think Congress will give EPA back the authority it had prior to Mr. Cheney asking them to strip that authority, which I think is unfortunate. I think EPA should be doing it. I think EPA is much better suited to do it. Not probably your cup of tea.
Over here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Ace. I'm a senior at Wellesley College and a fellow at the Albright Institute. I think climate change is definitely one of the most defining challenges that our generation must face. So I want to thank you for addressing this topic this year. From your talk, it seems like progress in the government is very slow, as well as in the international community. And you also mentioned that in China, one of the biggest hopes of progress are the people at the bottom of the pyramid pressuring the government to do something. And it seems to me like in our country, a lot of progress in the past has come from the public pressuring the government to make change, turning things that were impossible or undoable into possibilities. And so my question is, do you think that we need more activism, grassroots movement building, and nonviolent direct action in terms of addressing climate change in the U.S.?
Well, I definitely do. I think that the combination of citizens making their views heard through a variety of organizations, whatever they are. I think actually it's the multiplicity of a lot of the organizations coming together. They might not have exactly the same agenda on everything, but the numbers of people raising it. And I do think that there is citizen power in this, and in terms of not buying from certain companies or a variety of different aspects, definitely, because it's the only way that in a democracy you do get changes. And the people in Congress, most of whom are not into this, I think need to know that the people who are going to vote for them care. And the only way to do that is through citizen action.
An informed, engaged democracy, citizenry is essential to democracy. I think the great thing about, I started out as a grassroots organizer. I know what it's like to go door to door and try and get people to care about what's happening in their community. You guys have such better tools than we had. You don't have to go door to door. You can talk to people through all your electronic equipment. But to Madeleine's point, if our elected officials don't hear from the people, they will conclude, and I guess rightfully so, that we don't care. It's up to us to raise our voices and force them to hear our voices.
Can I make one additional point? One of the big discussions in the United States at this moment is, what is the role of government? Government is the price of living in a civilized society. And as Carol described, who makes the rules, you can't do it individually. You can have citizen pressure, but citizens alone can't make the rules. They need a government that is responsive to them. But the larger, much larger discussion is, what is the role of government in the 21st century? Government is not evil. Government is on your side if you have, in fact, voted for the people that are reflective of your views. And so that's part. There's no way that you can have fracking or whatever, all the things you've been talking about, if you don't believe in government.
Right.
Over here.
Good evening. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm Sarah. I'm a senior studying political science, and I'm also a fellow at the Albright Institute. I did my Albright internship at the Clinton Foundation, which works on the C40 initiative, our partnership of local cities around the world working to reduce pollution in their cities. So given the current gridlock in DC over this issue, I'm wondering if we should be paying greater attention to local governments to take action that the federal government is unable to.
Different levels of government have different tools. I mean, a mayor can't set a national car standard, but mayors are a hugely important part of the climate effort, and you have some of the most, I think, exciting work going on a city-by-city basis. And mayors completely get the resiliency adaptation challenge. They're the ones who are on the front line when that tornado comes through, when that hurricane comes through. And I think that the mayors are some of my favorite people when it comes to this issue. Very creative. They've got to get it done. They're not around for a long time, and they don't have the luxury of these effectively 10-year terms that congressmen end up serving because they can get themselves reelected in perpetuity. Seriously. But there's a good group of mayors who are really trying to figure out the right solutions. And they have a power that the federal government doesn't have, which is they have zoning power. The federal government cannot come in and make zoning decisions. And when it comes to things like resiliency and adaptation, zoning is going to be a very important tool.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here today. And as an Albright Fellow, I have to thank you for the last 2.5 weeks. They've been incredible. So my question is related to the role of government again. And as a member of the transportation group, we were talking about a lot of policies that, the Istanbul group. We talked about a lot of the kinds of policies that you can implement to change behavior. And in a lot of our conversations this week, it seemed that for a problem this big, government really is where the solutions lie to a large extent. But how do we, first of all, combat the effects of people's distrust in government and the inefficacy that in some ways causes because people don't invest? And then how do we ensure that at the same time we are safeguarding those democratic rights that are so precious to us throughout the world? I was in Istanbul this summer at Gezi Parkı, so, I've democracy on the brain.
Well, you are asking the basic political philosophy question, which is how you get government to respond to the people and why you need it. I think that, and it goes in many ways to the mayor. When I said there wasn't faith in institutions, what I have found in looking at it from a political science perspective is basically there is faith, the lower level of government. So the mayors are actually very popular because they are doing specific things and they are responding very specifically. It's not true everywhere, but I do think that part of the problem, and Turkey is a very special issue, and trying to figure out how democracy operates within a system that was an evolution of democracy. It's very, Turkey is in an evolutionary phase as far as democracy is concerned. It is also trying to do something that is very difficult at this point. As I was introduced, I am chairman of the National Democratic Institute, and one of the questions that's always out there is whether one can have a Muslim democracy. And the bottom line is we have always thought there is nothing inimical between democracy and Islam. It's a matter of how it is used. And so the question is to what extent any democracy is comfortable listening to its people. And having a system that it allows, when we started NDI, we were trying to figure out what the most important thing was about democracy. People say elections, necessary but not sufficient. Ultimately, one of the things that's absolutely key to democracy is having an opposition party. It's easier when you're not in the opposition, having been in both. But the bottom line is because that provides the voters with a choice and requires accountability of the government. And so you have to have that. What is magical about the United States, despite whatever our faults are, is that people actually leave office, when they have been voted out. And so
It takes a while sometimes.
but they don't say I haven't, I'm not leaving. And actually these are very important days. Last year at this time, we were involved in an inauguration. The transfer of power in the United States, this time it was the same president, but it's fascinating to watch and how it happens. And so an evolving democracy is not particularly good at that and feeling comfortable with it. And clearly what was going on in Istanbul was a very tragic aspect for Turkish democracy. Yeah.
I think we go over here now. And I'm afraid we have way more people with questions than we have time for,
we'll be
so
short.
please try to
Ask yes, no.
there we go.
Only if that were possible.
Of course, as a journalist,
Yes.
I'm trained to never ask a yes/no question.
We're trying to give yes/no answers.
Hi, my name is Sarah Zemlach. I'm the class of 2014. We discussed earlier the importance of technology, and I guess as a chemistry major, one of the things that I see is there's a big gap between development of a new technology and implementation. And when it comes to technology, specifically within renewable sources, we see so many rising and developing technologies. And I guess my question is, how do we make sure from a wide-scale approach that we're moving forward with the appropriate technology, and how can you fill that gap between development and implementation on a large scale?
Well, I think one of the ways you create the demand. So the government sets requirements, whether it's renewable portfolio standards, so that as these technologies come to the fore, there's actually a marketplace, right? And the investors in the technology know that that technology is going to get sold and there's going to be a return on the investment. We also talked about tax policies. I think one of the complicated things for government to do, and this became a bit of the debate around the Recovery Act, and there was a lot of rhetoric that actually didn't have anything to do with the reality of the Recovery Act, which was the single largest investment in clean energy technology in the history of the United States. But where does the government, the government providing financing is not necessarily the government choosing winners and losers in terms of technology. But nevertheless, recognizing that perhaps in the economic downturn, this was certainly true, Wall Street simply wasn't available to make the kind of investments they historically would have made in new technologies, or for example, to buy some of the tax credits that the wind and solar companies had, but needed to monetize. And so, using government policy to help bridge that gap from, invention to implementation, I think is an important role for government. It's not easy to do. There's lots of pitfalls, but you don't always have to spend money. Sometimes you can use the regulatory power. When we banned CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, because they were contributing to the hole in the upper ozone, Congress in 1990 said they're gone on a date certain. That created an automatic opportunity. We weren't going to give up our air conditioning and refrigeration, and so that meant there was going to be a replacement. Turned out not to be such a great replacement, but at the time it seemed like a reasonable replacement. That's, I think, an instance of where government creates a market opportunity, and so you have the kind of investment, and you bring these things to market, in that case, much more quickly and much more cheaply than anyone imagined.
Over here.
Kind of addressing both the question that was just raised and your comment earlier, Mr. Thomson, about properly pricing carbon. We here in Massachusetts have begun a new group called Environmental Tax Reform, and we are working to build the political will to enact a primarily revenue-neutral carbon tax here in Massachusetts. We have commissioned a study by a leading econometric firm in Washington, D.C., and we think that we can implement such a tax in such a way that would raise our state GDP, increase the number of jobs, and reduce emissions, all while protecting the poor and the lower income or non-income earning people in our state. Adele Morris of the Brookings Institute also just released a paper, and I'm curious to know your thoughts about this. She is suggesting that states implement President Obama's recent regulations through a carbon tax, by offering a carbon tax. I would love to know what you think about that idea.
So just quickly.
What's your name, please? Sorry.
My name is Jessica Langerman.
So just quickly, by way of background, so you'll understand this, the president the EPA, under the president's direction, will be setting standards on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from new fossil fuels and from existing fossil fuel electricity generators, okay? And the states, so those standards will be set, how much has to be reduced, but the states, each state will get to write a plan on how the facilities within their jurisdiction will actually do that. And they have a lot of flexibility. And so what some people are suggesting is that states would use some sort of carbon cap, maybe some trading regime. I think that's actually what she may be talking about. And that while there aren't a lot of efficiencies with one state, maybe 10 states would join together. So what you couldn't get from Congress in terms of a cap and this trading mechanism, you will end up getting by states voluntarily opting into it. And you're probably all going, well, those governors aren't going to do that. But there's a reason those governors might do that, because the industries that have to actually reduce their pollution, they may think that this kind of mechanism is the most cost-effective way to do it. If I'm Florida Power and Light, I don't just own facilities in Florida where I come from. I own them now. I generate electricity in Michigan, Illinois, Indiana. As a business person, I'm going to look across my fleet that generates electricity. I'm going to want to manage this requirement. Some things I may want to reduce more, some things slightly less. The kind of programs that people are talking about, federal government probably can't impose, but the states could certainly adopt and work together. Oops. I think you're okay.
You're good.
Okay, I happened to attend the most recent Democratic gubernatorial forum in Lincoln. 2 weeks ago, none of the Democratic candidates were willing to commit to a carbon tax. By Saturday, partly as the result of our organization's grassroots lobbying, all 5 have committed to either supporting or being open to supporting a primarily revenue-neutral carbon tax here in Massachusetts.
So by revenue neutral, some other tax will be reduced in exchange for this tax. Are they talking about doing a workplace tax, reducing some other?
So they're talking about reducing corporate income taxes,
Okay.
personal income taxes, and also the sales tax to make
Okay.
it as progressive as possible.
Okay, over here.
Thank you for having us. My main concern is water, which is a finite resource and one we cannot live without. And could you talk about it a little bit vis-a-vis fracking, which uses gobs and gobs of water?
Your name, please?
Thank you. My name is Judith Morton. I'm just a concerned citizen.
Thank you. And you know, water is a finite resource, and I think we have a long history, not just in the United States, but around the world, of thinking of it as an infinite resource. Now, if we do some things to protect nature, protect recharge areas, keep our fresh water in the system rather than discharging it out to the salt water, we can do a lot to sustain it. But we have tended not to make those kind of decisions, and we are increasingly facing real issues about water. I mean, I think there are people who would suggest some of the issues even in places like Syria are related to water, and certainly climate change is only going to make the freshwater issues more difficult. As the sea level starts to rise in my home state of Florida, you'll have saltwater intrusion into the freshwater supplies. Our drinking water in Florida largely comes from an aquifer, which we're sucking dry, which is creating the opportunity for the salt water to come in. You know, this is one of those issues where there's a lot that the federal government can do, but quite frankly, it requires a lot of local effort, and then it requires cross-boundary efforts. You know, if you look at a map of the world, which we did earlier today, and you look at the sort of ecological watershed boundaries, guess what? They don't line up with the political boundaries, right? And so whether it's my home state of Florida, the northern part of Florida is very dependent on Georgia and Alabama for its fresh water into the Apalachicola Bay, but guess what? Georgia's decided to keep it all. Or we looked at, Ethiopia putting in a dam, and guess what's gonna happen to Egypt? They're not going to fare so well because the water that used to come is not going to come anymore because it's going to be stopped up by the dam. So I think we have to think about this both on a local level and on these sort of watershed basis, which I think puts us right back into the international arena because we're going to be crossing boundaries. The U.S. shares lots of water supplies with Canada and with Mexico, the Rio Grande.
I think the wars of the 21st century will not be over oil, they'll be over water. I think that's the...
Over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Beatrice Nessen, and I want to say that I regret that when I was at Wellesley, I didn't have the opportunity to have such great interdisciplinary opportunities or the Albright Institute. My question,
You could come back.
Sure. This is the closest, maybe. So you can answer this a yes or no, but I know that natural gas is going to be a great resource for America, and if we can export it to the degree that you talked about, it would probably be beneficial for our national security as well as our balance of payments. But in the back of my mind, I'm wondering what that does for climate control and what that does for as an incentive or disincentive for alternative forms of energy.
So, I mean, there are two issues to think about. If we had had this discussion about natural gas a few years ago, we would have thought, oh my God, it's so much better than coal when it comes to making electricity. It's so much better to run, trucks on than conventional oil. We don't think that anymore. It is better, but it's not as much better as we thought, because when we actually look at all of the effects, the gases that are released in transporting it, the gases that are released in extracting it, it turns out to be better, but not as much better. We cannot think of it as the solution. Now, if China were to decide to build natural gas electric generating facilities as opposed to coal, that would probably be good news. But then you have to look at the economics of it, and you have to look at the capital investments. Until very recently, we were still operating power plants built in the 50s here in the United States. These things stay online a really, really long time. And so one of the concerns I have is we're going to build a whole natural gas power generating apparatus in this country. You know, in 1990, all the people who owned the 1950 era power plants told Congress, oh, don't worry, we're shutting them down. We're just now shutting them down, 20-some years later. And so I worry about this large-scale capital investment in this technology rather than an investment in solar and wind. And so far more important in some ways, I mean, the immediate environmental stuff is important, but it's this sort of commitment we make without realizing we're making a commitment. And I think that's what we should take pause and just say, is this really where we want to be? And what does it mean if we're still there, 20, 30 years from now using these facilities?
We've got about 5 minutes, which might be time for 2 more questions, maybe 3 if people are really quick. So back over here.
Hi, my name is Alice. I'm a sophomore at Wellesley College. I hope to participate in the Albright Institute in the future. But several decades ago, there was a kind of a radical idea of nuclear winter that using an isolated set of nuclear incidents to lower the global temperature by a few degrees. And now that theory has mainly passed in the academic context, but my question is, what is your opinion in using such drastic global methods of combating climate change versus these specialized local actions that we've been talking about?
Geoengineering, I think, is the...
Yeah, I think geoengineering is the terminology that's used. I'm not smart enough to be there. I mean, it just feels like, we know we can do things. This idea of doing things out there, it just feels way too far afield for my level of comfort. I don't know, maybe you.
No, I mean, all I know is that one can talk a lot about the unintended consequences of decisions. And one of the issues that I always talk about is when President Eisenhower gave the Atoms for Peace speech in 1953, and which led to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was a good idea, but it's under that we sold nuclear technology to Iran. So I think that one has to kind of think through what the unintended consequence of a decision to use
put a shield around the earth and hope that somehow or another we'll be protecting ourselves.
Yeah.
That's
Okay, that was nice and short. Over here.
My name is Josie D. Seagren, and I'm a senior at Wellesley this year. So we mentioned a bunch of different interest groups. We have the very vocal naysayers, the general population, the 2,500 scientists that have real evidence that climate change and these environmental issues are real. And then we have the policymakers. So my kind of string of questions is, how do we encourage these scientists and the silent people that you mentioned to be more vocal? And then in turn, how do we get the policymakers to listen to them? And then lastly, how do we educate the general population beyond good journalism and creative mayors?
Well, I think partially the education has to begin a long time before people get to vote. I do think that the more that science and various parts of this are taught in high schools and even earlier, there's been all the question about STEM education. I think that is really absolutely essential so that you begin to develop an educated population. I'm going to say something really strange, which is that lobbyists have a very bad name. The truth is that actually lobbying in many ways is having people educate the policymakers. When I worked for Ed Muskie, believe it or not, I didn't know everything. And the bottom line is, and I had my views, having been a good graduate, a student forever and a student here, I believed in international trade completely. until people that made shoes came to see me and said, how are we going to make a living? The bottom line is, some of those were lobbyists. But the bottom line is, the interest groups have to have a way of having access to the policymakers. It could be going to see a staffer, but there needs to be that feeling and not kind of saying, I don't want to hear from X group. And I believe, as I do in education, that the best thing is to have a variety of opinions and to try to learn something from the people who come in and talk to you. So that would be something that I
Well,
think
and when I ran, the 8 years I ran EPA, I made a lot of decisions that affected the economy. I could only make those decisions because the people a lot smarter and more knowledgeable about those issues came and talked to me about, Carol, if you do it this way, we can make a better car, a cleaner car. If you do it that way, it's going to be really hard for us. And so this idea that somehow or another Washington is full of lobbyists, lobbyists are just a way of educating. You know, if I could do one thing, I would change our voting system in this country. Our participation is woefully low. Not enough people are engaged. I would make it a lot easier for people to vote. I would move it to the weekends. I mean, whatever the experts say, because I do think if people take the time to vote, I have great confidence in people, they will take the time to become informed. Right now we have far too few people participating in our electoral process, and I think we are all bearing and feeling the consequences of that.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. I don't know if anyone here is going to come up and finish it or if it's on me to finish it, but I'll thank Madeleine and Carol. This has been amazing for me to listen to and to meet you guys for the first time and engage. And the questions from the audience were all terrific, and I'm sure we could have gone for a couple more hours at least. But thanks so much for coming. Thanks you for coming and participating. And
everybody for the questions. Thank you. Thank you for your great questions.